Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. Hiding low in a shallow hole near the fighting, a boy no older than 13 fixes a too big steel helmet that keeps sliding down over his forehead. The heavy gear looks almost silly against his skinny shoulders. He holds a beat-up rifle almost as tall as he is, his fingers shaking in the cold morning air. Around him, other boys, barely older, stand in line with tired men. Each one was forced into the army by a government that told them that dying for their country is not just good, but blessed by God. The quiet is broken only by the occasional snap of distant gunfire. Ahead, the faint shape of Iraqi positions glows with sharp wire and buried bombs. Beyond them, the silent danger of gun barrels waiting for what will surely come. An officer shouts an order. The boy jumps, then climbs up with the others, his knees banging against the dirt wall of the trench. The command is short, urgent, and final. Get ready to move forward. Some soldiers whisper prayers under their breath. Others grip prayer beads as tightly as their rifles. For many, it will be their first and last time in battle. The fear is strong, thick in the air like dust before a storm. This was not a one-time thing, but a sad pattern repeated across countless battlefields of the 1980s. The Iran-Iraq War forced not only grown men, but also children and old people into service, anyone who could carry a weapon or march forward when ordered. In Iran, the newly created Islamic Republic built a culture of sacrifice. Schools were emptied into training camps, and young boys were taught that heaven waited for those who gave their lives in battle. Plastic keys painted gold were hung around their necks, symbols of the keys to heaven they were promised if they died as heroes. It was an uncomfortable mix of faith, fear, and government propaganda. And yet, the war itself was not old-fashioned in size. Above these boys and their shaking friends, the roar of jet engines cut through the sky. Advanced fighter planes flew overhead, their shadows sweeping across the same fields where barefoot teenagers walked toward buried bombs. At the very moment when poisonous gas was choking soldiers in the mud, sleek phantom jets fought in the air above them. The war was a horrible contradiction. The most modern weapons of the late 20th century layered on top of the most basic, almost ancient human suffering below. The boy in the trench tightens his grip. The officer's shout comes again, louder this time. His heart races as he climbs up the muddy slope, sharp wire and gunfire waiting. What followed was predictable, and it would be repeated for 8 long years. Waves of people and faith thrown against steel and smoke. The Iran-Iraq War was not merely a fight between two armies. It was a test of beliefs, pride, and desperation. Iran, powered by the passion of its revolution, saw the war as both defense and holy struggle. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, saw it as a chance to take land, secure resources, and show power over the Gulf. Between them lay not just land, but millions of lives to be destroyed by the fire. As the boy takes his first steps into the storm of bullets, we, the watchers, decades later, are left with the troubling truth. This was a war where childhood itself became a weapon and where modern and ancient times collided on the same battlefield. Long before the first Iraqi tanks rolled across the border in 1980, the seeds of war had already been planted in the shifting sands of the Persian Gulf. The rivalry between Iran and Iraq was not simply a matter of fighting armies. It was an old argument shaped by location, identity, and ambition. At its heart lay the Shatt al-Arab, the great waterway where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers joined and flowed into the Gulf. Control of this waterway meant access to shipping, trade, and above all oil. For decades, Tehran and Baghdad argued over the river's ownership. The 1975 Algiers Agreement signed under the watch of foreign helpers was supposed to end the matter by dividing control. Yet to Saddam Hussein, the compromise was embarrassing. He had signed it under pressure, forced by a Kurdish rebellion that Iran had secretly armed. In his mind, the treaty was not a permanent settlement, but a wound to be avenged. Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich southwestern area, added another layer of tension. Known in Arabic as Awaz, its population included a large Arab minority, a fact Saddam hoped to use. He dreamed of taking over Khuzestan, showing it as a liberation of mistreated Arabs. While in truth, The area represented billions of barrels of oil, the lifeblood of modern war. To Baghdad, Khuzestan was not just a neighboring area. It was a prize worth risking everything for. Yet, land disputes were only part of the story. Iraq's Ba'ath government and Iran's monarchy, later its religious government, were completely different political creatures. In the 1970s, Iraq followed a non-religious authoritarian nationalism under the Ba'ath Party, while Iran remained under the Shah's Western-friendly monarchy until 1979. Both governments claimed leadership of the Persian Gulf, but neither could stand sharing power. Their rivalry was more than diplomatic. It was about survival. The Kurdish question added fuel to the fire. Both Tehran and Baghdad used Kurdish rebels across the border to weaken the other. Iran's weapon shipments to Iraqi Kurds in the early 1970s were important in forcing Saddam into the Algiers Agreement. But betrayal was the currency of regional politics. As soon as the ink dried, Tehran abandoned the Kurds, leaving them to Saddam's anger. The bitterness of these shifting alliances hardened Iraqi distrust and deepened Saddam's determination to one day settle scores. Beyond these disputes lay a larger cultural rivalry centuries in the making. Iran, heir to the Persian imperial tradition, looked back on its long history as the dominant power of the region. Iraq, seated in the fertile cradle of Mesopotamia, saw itself as the heartland of Arab civilization. For Saddam Hussein, the conflict was not only about land or oil, but about restoring Arab pride against Persian influence. To him, history was a battlefield just as much as Khuzestan's oil fields or the banks of the Shatt al-Arab. By the late 1970s, the relationship between Iran and Iraq had become a brittle truce, a fragile arrangement held together by little more than temporary convenience. Saddam simmered with anger. His ambitions held back but not destroyed. And then, in 1979, the revolution in Tehran would light the fuse. The old complaints, waterways, oil, borders, Kurds, were about to crash with a new unpredictable force, the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini and the birth of the Islamic Republic. In Saddam's eyes, the threat was no longer only about land. It was about beliefs. A war of borders was becoming a war of survival. In 1979, the Middle East shook as one of its oldest pillars collapsed. The Iranian monarchy under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi crumbled after months of protests, strikes, and violent crackdowns. In its place rose a completely new order, the Islamic Republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. For centuries, Shia Islam had shaped Persian identity. But now, for the first time in modern history, religion and government joined into a religious government that promised to export its revolution beyond Iran's borders. To Saddam Hussein, the development was unbearable. His Ba'ath government in Baghdad was non-religious, authoritarian, and fiercely nationalist. Religion, in his view, was a tool to be controlled, not the foundation of government. Yet just across the border, Iran had declared that Islam, and specifically Shia Islam, should be the guiding principle of politics. This was more than beliefs. Iraq itself was home to a majority Shia population long held down under Saddam's Sunni-controlled government. He feared that Khomeini's call to Islamic revolution would spread across the border like wildfire, threatening to make his grip on power unstable. The words from Tehran did little to calm those fears. Khomeini criticized Saddam and the Baathists as godless tyrants, while Iranian radio broadcasts urged Iraqi Shia to rise up. To Saddam, this was not mere propaganda. It was a knife at his throat. He saw himself as the shield of the Arab world, the defender not only of Iraq's independence, but of Arab civilization itself against what he painted as Persian invasion. In his speeches, he presented the coming conflict as a clash of cultures, Arab versus Persian, non-religious nationalism versus religious extremism. But beliefs were not the only calculation. Saddam also recognized opportunity. Iran, though vast and rich in oil, was in chaos after the revolution. Its army had been cleared of officers loyal to the Shah. Its air force, once one of the best equipped in the region, was damaged by desertions and punishments. Internal divisions grew. Ethnic minorities in Kurdistan, Baluchistan, and Khuzestan all pressed for self-rule. From Saddam's view, Iran was weak, distracted, and vulnerable. If ever there was a time to strike, it was now. He imagined a short, decisive war. His armies would cross the border, take the disputed Shatt al-Arab waterway, take over oil-rich Khuzestan, and present the Arab world with a victory that would crown him as its champion. In a single move, he could erase the embarrassment of the Algiers Agreement and raise Iraq to regional supremacy. Yet Saddam's reasoning also carried echoes of excessive pride. Like so many before him, he underestimated the toughness of a people who believed they were fighting not just for land, but for God. For the Islamic Republic, survival was sacred. What Saddam expected to be a quick border war would instead become one of the bloodiest standoffs of the 20th century. By September 1980, the die was cast. The Iraqi dictator had convinced himself that the revolution next door was both a threat to his rule and a golden chance for conquest. He was about to risk everything. And when his first moves came, the entire Middle East would feel the ground shake. On the morning of September 22, 1980, the calm of the Persian sky shattered. Iraqi fighter jets roared across the border, their engines screaming like a sudden storm. Their mission was clear: destroy Iran's air force in a single decisive blow. It was a page borrowed from Israel's 1967 playbook, the famous surprise strike that had won the Six-Day War. Saddam hoped for the same result, a lightning attack that would freeze Iran before it could even resist. But what looked brilliant on paper failed in reality. The Iraqi Air Force lacked the advanced long-range bombers and exact strike ability Israel once had. Their bombs fell clumsily on Iranian runways, leaving many aircraft untouched. Iran had learned from watching the wars of its neighbors. Its prized F-14 Tomcats, F-4 Phantoms, and transport planes were not sitting vulnerable on open runway. They were hidden away in hardened shelters built with American help during the Shah's years. When the dust settled, Saddam's gamble had failed. The blow meant to be decisive was little more than a scratch. The very next day, Saddam unleashed his ground forces. 6 divisions thundered across the border, armored columns moving forward with confidence toward Khuzestan and the Shatt al-Arab. Dust clouds rolled behind them, their tracks carving deep scars into the land. The strategy was simple: take Iran's oil-rich land before the broken Islamic Republic could organize its defenses. For a moment, success seemed possible. Town after town fell under the weight of the Iraqi push. Yet, the Iranian response came faster than expected. Though reeling from revolution, the Iranian people rallied with amazing determination. Revolutionary guards, quickly organized militias, and remaining parts of the Shah's regular army set aside their differences and moved to resist. They launched payback air raids on Iraqi oil fields, military bases, and even the unfinished Osirak nuclear reactor near Baghdad. Operation Scorched Sword, the daring strike against that reactor, sent shock waves far beyond the battlefield. It was a message that Iran still had claws. And on the ground, the Iraqi advance soon began to slow down. In cities like Khorramshahr and Abadan, Iraqi tanks met not open fields but narrow streets and blocked houses. The war that Saddam imagined as swift conquest was already changing into something far more complex and brutal. A grinding, bloody standoff where every block, every riverbank would demand a price in blood. The invasion of September 1980 was supposed to be the beginning of Iraq's victory. Instead, it was the opening act of an 8-year nightmare that neither side had fully imagined. When Iraqi tanks rolled into Khorramshahr in late September 1980, Saddam's commanders believed it would fall within days. Instead, the battle dragged on for 49 painful days, transforming the small port city into a legend. To the Iraqis, it was an obstacle that refused to give in. To the Iranians, it became a symbol of resistance, remembered forever as Khorramshahr, the city of blood. The fighting was brutal and close. Iraqi columns tried to force their way through narrow streets only to be attacked by defenders firing from windows, rooftops, and alleyways. Houses became fortresses. Mosques turned into sniper nests. Every block was fought over. The Iraqi army, equipped with modern tanks and big guns, found itself stuck in a maze of city combat for which it was poorly prepared. The Iranians, many of them volunteers with little training, fought with desperation that challenged their lack of experience. Entire families joined the defense. Teenagers alongside veterans of the Shah's army. Revolutionary guards fighting shoulder to shoulder with civilians. Deaths and injuries climbed at an alarming pace. Nearly 7,000 dead and wounded on both sides, 200 Iraqi armored vehicles destroyed. For weeks, the streets of Khorramshahr echoed with gunfire, bomb blasts, and the cries of the wounded. What made this battle so important was not only its human cost, but its symbolism. Saddam had promised a swift victory, yet here his army bled day after day for a single city. Every hour of resistance gave Iran time to regroup. Every ruined street became a monument to defiance. Iranian propaganda seized upon the struggle, broadcasting tales of heroism to rally the nation. Khorramshahr is not just a city, one broadcast declared. It is the heart of Iran itself. In the end, the Iraqis did take Khorramshahr, but their victory was hollow. The city lay in ruins, its population scattered, its streets soaked with blood. Yet, the delay had bought Iran something priceless: time. By the time the Iraqi flag flew over the wreckage, 200,000 Iranian volunteers had arrived at the front lines, ready to continue the fight. The invaders, meant to be unstoppable, were now stuck in a war that promised no easy end. Khorramshahr was lost, but its defense lit the spirit of Iranian resistance. In the years to come, the name of the City of Blood would echo across the battlefields, a reminder that no conquest would come without terrible cost. By early 1981, Khorramshahr had fallen, and Saddam's armies had dug themselves deep in Iranian soil. Yet, for all their early gains, Iraq had failed to deliver the decisive knockout that Saddam had promised. Iran, though battered, was still standing, and it was preparing to strike back. On January 5, 1981, the Islamic Republic launched Operation Nasr, or Victory. It was to be Iran's first major counterattack of the war. 3 massive tank columns rumbled forward toward the surrounded city of Desful, their tracks churning the earth, their engines thundering with the promise of payback. Revolutionary Guards marched alongside them, believing that faith and determination could make up for poor training and disorganized command. For the leadership in Tehran, this was more than a military operation. It was a symbolic statement that the revolution would not be broken. But the Iraqis were waiting. Observation planes had spotted the Iranian columns crossing the Karkeh River, stripping away any chance of surprise. Saddam's forces dug in, laying traps across the dangerous floodplains that surrounded the Iraqi-held positions. The land itself seemed to betray the attackers. Mud slowed down tanks while open ground left advancing troops exposed to big gun fire. When the battle was joined, it was a slaughter. Iranian tanks moved forward bravely but were picked off one by one. Between 100 and 200 armored vehicles were destroyed, burning wrecks left scattered across the fields like monuments to overconfidence. The foot soldiers that followed did little better. Iraqi bunkers reinforced and supplied poured machine gun fire into waves of attackers. Bomb rounds fell steadily, tearing gaps in Iranian formations. What Tehran had hoped would be a rallying cry for the revolution instead became a bitter reminder of its military weakness. Yet even in defeat, the Iranians learned hard lessons. They realized that sheer willpower could not beat dug-in defenses. Unplanned attacks without coordination or air support led only to destruction. Still, the leadership in Tehran refused to accept defeat. For them, every setback was recast as heroism. Every loss as proof of the rightness of their cause. Speeches echoed across the nation. Our blood is the ink with which victory will be written. For the soldiers who survived Desful, those words rang hollow. They had seen the fields littered with burning tanks, the swollen rivers carrying away bodies, the cries of the wounded unanswered in the chaos. Operation Nasr had failed, but the war was far from over. Iran's leaders remained convinced that pure persistence, pure sacrifice would eventually shatter Iraq's defenses. And so, in the months to come, they would try again. If Iran's ground forces struggled to match Iraq's dug-in armies, in the skies they told a very different story. Despite the revolution's removals and international punishments, Iran's air force remained one of the most advanced in the region. The Shah had purchased advanced American aircraft, F-4 Phantoms, F-5 Tigers, and the crown jewel, the F-14 Tomcat. Many Western watchers assumed that after 1979, these aircraft would rust away without parts or knowledge. Instead, Iranian pilots and engineers found ways to keep them flying, taking parts from old machines, making up repairs and relying on pure cleverness. On September 30th, 1980, just days into the war, Iran launched one of its boldest missions, Operation Scorched Sword. A group of F-4 Phantoms streaked across the border and struck the unfinished Osirak nuclear reactor near Baghdad. Though the damage was not complete, the raid shocked the world. It proved that Iran, weakened and isolated, could still project power deep into Iraqi land. More importantly, it sent a chilling message to Saddam Hussein. His dreams of nuclear ability would not go unchallenged. Yet, Iran's boldest achievement in the air came 2 years later. In April 1981, Iranian pilots completed a daring raid on Iraq's H-3 airbase, located far in the country's western desert near the Jordanian border. To reach it, the strike force of Phantoms and Tomcats had to fly a long route, avoiding Iraqi radar and flying low over the ground. For hours, they crossed empty desert unseen and unheard. When they finally swooped down on H-3, the Iraqis were unprepared. Within minutes, the base was a smoking ruin. At least 27 Iraqi aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and the Iranians escaped with barely a scratch. For a nation reeling from defeats on the ground, these victories in the air carried huge symbolic weight. Iranian propaganda celebrated the pilots as national heroes, modern-day knights defending the revolution from tyranny. School children memorized their names, and newspapers claimed the raids as proof that God's favor was with the Islamic Republic. For Saddam, however, the losses were an embarrassment. His carefully built image as a strong man, the invincible leader of the Arab world, had been dented. The man who promised a swift victory now watched as his air force, one of the pillars of his government, was damaged in its own hangars. The contrast was stark. On the ground, poorly armed volunteers marched into bomb fields with little hope of survival. In the skies, disciplined professionals carried out missions of surgical exactness. Together, they revealed the split nature of the Iran-Iraq War, a conflict where medieval sacrifice and modern warfare lived together uneasily, feeding both tragedy and legend. In time, however, even the brilliance of the Iranian Air Force would not be enough. The war was settling into a rhythm more familiar to the 20th century, a rhythm of wearing down, standoff, and slaughter. By late 1981, the war that Saddam had promised would be swift had sunk into a grim standoff. Across hundreds of miles of front line, the landscape transformed into a vision that eerily echoed Europe's 6 decades earlier. Trenches carved into the earth, sharp wire strung across no man's land, and the deafening rhythm of big guns pounding the soil day and night. For Iran, the revolution was still fresh, and its leaders clung to faith as a weapon. Outnumbered in tanks and big guns, they embraced a brutal strategy: human wave attacks. Columns of young volunteers, some barely in their teens, charged straight against Iraqi defenses, armed with little more than rifles, bayonets, and a strong belief that death in battle meant heroism. Before moving forward, commanders handed out plastic keys painted gold meant to symbolize the keys to heaven. Boys marched into bomb fields singing hymns, clearing the way with their bodies for the soldiers behind them. The results were devastating. Entire formations were cut down by machine gun fire or torn apart by explosives. Iraqi trenches filled with the dead, their uniforms stained with dust and blood. And yet, when one wave stumbled, another would be sent forward. Iran paid in flesh for every meter of ground gained. The Iraqis, meanwhile, fought with a different kind of stiffness. Saddam's officers, terrified of upsetting their leader, rarely showed creativity. They clung to their walls, unwilling to move around or adapt. Iraqi soldiers crouched in bunkers, firing on moving forward Iranians until their magazines ran dry. The dictator's paranoia meant that disobedience, even if tactically smart, could mean death. Thus, the battlefield became still. Iranians throwing men into the grinder, Iraqis stubbornly holding on. It was a horrible theater of repetition. Reports from the front described days when the same patch of ground changed hands multiple times, each shift paid for with hundreds of lives. Veterans compared the mud, the wire, and the endless shelling to the killing fields of the Great War. A historian later wrote, "The Iran-Iraq War was World War I fought with the weapons of World War II under the shadow of the Cold War. The human cost was staggering. Families across Iran sent sons to the front, sometimes 3 or 4 from a single household. Posters of the fallen decorated city walls. Funerals became daily rituals. In Iraq, soldiers endured a different suffering. They fought not out of faith, but out of fear of their own government. Letters home spoke of tiredness, despair, and the feeling of being trapped in a war that had no purpose, no end. By the close of 1981, the war had stopped resembling the quick conquest Saddam imagined. It had become a grinding contest of wearing down where courage, passion, and even advanced weapons seemed powerless to break the deadlock. Both nations were bleeding, yet neither would give in. The trenches of Iran and Iraq had become an open grave that promised only more sacrifice. By early 1982, Iranian commanders realized that their human wave attacks, while costly, had revealed cracks in Iraq's defenses. The Revolutionary Guards and Basij militias had bled for months, battering the enemy line until they finally sensed weakness. Tehran prepared to launch a massive operation, one that would prove to the world that the Islamic Republic could not only defend itself, but also take back its lost land. In March, the Iranians unleashed Operation Fath Mobin, undeniable victory. It was more than just another push. It was an avalanche. Tens of thousands of troops surged forward in a coordinated attack. Across the plains of Khuzestan, unlike earlier battles, this time Iran combined mass foot soldier charges with focused big gun fire and the guidance of experienced officers from the old Shah-era army. The Iraqis dug into their still positions were caught off balance. The attack tore through Saddam's lines. Entire Iraqi divisions found themselves surrounded as Iranian fighters poured into their sides. Prisoners were taken in the thousands. Weapons seized by the truckload. Iraqi soldiers who had once mocked the poorly armed volunteers now watched in horror as wave after wave overran their defenses. By May 1982, Iranian forces had freed Khorramshahr. The victory came at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands of Iranians lay dead or wounded, but its symbolic power was huge. For Tehran, this was no longer simply a war of survival. It was proof that the revolution itself was divinely blessed. Crowds filled the streets of Iranian cities to celebrate, chanting, "Khorramshahr is free." The city, once known as the City of Blood, was reborn as the beating heart of national pride. For Saddam Hussein, the loss was devastating. His dreams of a swift conquest had collapsed, and his army stood embarrassed. In a fit of rage and paranoia, he turned his anger inward. At least 300 officers and 10 generals were killed, accused of cowardice and betrayal. The message was clear: failure on the battlefield meant death at home. Iraqi commanders learned to fear their leader more than the enemy. The contrast between the two nations could not have been sharper. Iran, exhausted but victorious, embraced its suffering as a badge of honor. Every hero's grave was a rallying point. Every loss was reframed as proof of God's will. Iraq, meanwhile, staggered under the weight of defeat and a dictator's cruelty. The embarrassment of Khorramshahr did not merely weaken Saddam's army, it poisoned its spirit. And yet, for all Iran's victories, the war was far from over. Rather than negotiating from a position of strength, Iran's leaders chose to push further. They were no longer happy with taking back their land. They now sought to bring down Saddam's government itself. The war, already brutal, was about to get even bloodier. By mid-1982, Iran had taken back its occupied lands. Khorramshahr had been freed in victory, Iraqi forces driven back to the border. To many, this was the natural point for peace. Saddam, embarrassed and reeling from his defeats, even signaled willingness to talk. But in Tehran, the revolutionary leadership saw things differently. Victory on defense was not enough. The supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini declared that the war would continue until Saddam's Ba'athist government was destroyed and replaced by an Islamic republic. For Iran, this was no longer just a defensive war. It had become a holy mission. Thus, in July 1982, Iran launched Operation Ramadan, its first major attack into Iraqi land. Over 100,000 fighters, including Revolutionary Guards and Basij militias, marched across the border. Many were barely trained, some as young as 12, their gold-painted keys to heaven hanging from their necks. Iranian propaganda framed the attack as a modern crusade, a test of faith against tyranny. The Iraqis, however, were waiting. Saddam's commanders had built strong positions around Basra, Iraq's second-largest city, preparing for exactly such an attack. What followed was one of the bloodiest chapters of the entire war. Iranian troops moved forward with passion, chanting religious slogans as they stormed Iraqi trenches. For the first hours, their passion seemed unstoppable. But then the Iraqi defenses unleashed their full fury. Big gun attacks, machine gun fire, and most terrifying of all, chemical weapons. Mustard gas drifted across the battlefield, burning eyes and lungs, leaving blisters on skin. Soldiers collapsed in agony, clutching their throats, blinded and gasping for air. The use of such weapons was a clear violation of the Geneva Protocol. But Saddam cared little for international law. For his government, survival justified any means. The cost to Iran was staggering. Over 20,000 men were killed in Operation Ramadan along with 400 armored vehicles. Iraq, though battered, lost fewer, about 9,000 soldiers and 700 vehicles. The difference was crushing. What had been framed as the first step in bringing the revolution to Baghdad instead became a nightmare of mass graves and shattered illusions. And yet, Tehran refused to give in. Iranian leaders told their people that heroism was victory, that every loss was proof of rightness. Iraqi state media, for its part, boasted of defeating the Persian hordes. In truth, both sides had paid dearly for a stretch of desert that neither would control for long. Operation Ramadan marked a turning point. The war was no longer limited to disputed borders. It was now an invasion, a holy war against a neighboring government. Iran's choice to carry the fight into Iraq made sure that what might have ended in 1982 would drag on for 6 more years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The front lines had shifted, but the war itself had hardened into something far more dangerous. An endless struggle fueled not by strategy, but by beliefs, revenge, and pride. By late 1982, the Iran-Iraq War was no longer a two-sided conflict. It had become a struggle that pulled in the wider world, a substitute arena where the rivalries of the Cold War, the ambitions of Arab monarchies, and the worries of global oil markets came together. The first shift came from within the Arab world. For decades, Saddam Hussein had styled himself as a champion of Arab nationalism, the non-religious strongman who would defend Arab pride. When Iran pushed Iraqi forces back across the border, Saddam's defeat threatened not just his government, but the balance of power in the Gulf. Alarm bells rang in Riyadh, Kuwait City, and the palaces of the smaller Gulf monarchies. If Iran toppled Saddam, what would stop Khomeini's revolution from spreading into their own Shia populations? Saudi Arabia and Kuwait opened their treasuries. Billions of dollars flowed into Baghdad, eventually adding up to some $60 billion in help per year. New tanks, big guns, and aircraft poured into Iraq, purchased with Gulf oil money, and shipped from factories across the Soviet Union, France, and even the United States. Saddam, once on the verge of collapse, was now held up by an international group of nervous neighbors and practical great powers. Syria stood as the exception, a rival to Iraq within the Ba'athist movement. Damascus sided with Tehran. President Hafez al-Assad closed a vital pipeline that carried Iraqi oil to the Mediterranean, costing Baghdad billions each month. This brotherly betrayal deepened Iraq's isolation in the Levant, but did little to offset the tidal wave of Arab Gulf support. Beyond the region, the Cold War giants took their positions. The Soviet Union, long Iraq's main arms supplier, sped up shipments of tanks, aircraft, and surface-to-air missiles. Western Europe, particularly France, sold advanced Mirage fighters and Exocet missiles to Saddam's forces. Even the United States, still hurting from the trauma of the Iranian hostage crisis, leaned decidedly toward Baghdad. By 1982, Washington provided Iraq with billions of dollars in loans, satellite intelligence on Iranian troop movements, and secret political backing. The Reagan administration saw Iran not as a revolutionary state to be tolerated, but as a destabilizing force that had to be contained. For Iran, the international picture was far bleaker. Isolated after the revolution, it relied on limited support from Syria and Libya and on smuggling networks to keep its weapons working. Its leaders framed this isolation as proof of their rightness. The whole world might stand against them, but they claimed God stood with Iran. Propaganda emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and the idea that they were reliving the battles of early Islam, outnumbered yet divinely guided. The war's internationalization also changed its character. With huge sums of Gulf money and the quiet blessing of both superpowers, Saddam could continue fighting indefinitely. Iran, surrounded and punished, leaned ever harder on human waves and holy passion to match Iraq's growing collection of weapons. What had begun as a border dispute now loomed as a war that threatened not only two nations, but the fragile order of the entire Middle East. The trenches remained the same: mud, wire, and blood. But above them, a global chessboard was taking shape. While the land war stagnated in trenches and ruined cities, another front opened on the waters of the Persian Gulf. By 1984, both Iran and Iraq sought to break the standoff by striking where their enemy was most vulnerable: the arteries of oil that kept their economies alive and the world's markets supplied. This struggle came to be known as the Tanker War. Iraq fired the first shots. Its air force, now equipped with French-supplied Exocet missiles and advanced Mirage fighters, targeted Iranian shipping in the Gulf. Oil tankers became floating targets, slow, huge, and impossible to disguise. Flames and black smoke often rose above the horizon as missiles slammed into steel hulls, setting oceans afire. Saddam hoped to provoke Iran into payback that would draw the United States and its allies into direct confrontation with Tehran. Iran responded in kind. Speedboats of the Revolutionary Guard, loaded with machine guns and rocket launchers, swarmed shipping lanes. They struck not only Iraqi tankers, but also the vessels of neutral Gulf states that supported Baghdad. The narrow Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which a large portion of the world's oil supply passed, became a path of danger. Captains sailed with dread, insurance rates went up, and global oil markets shook with each attack. The toll was staggering. Over the course of 5 years, 546 commercial vessels were damaged or destroyed. More than 400 sailors were killed. Many burned alive when blazing oil spread across the sea. The Gulf's turquoise waters were stained with oil slicks that stretched for miles, and the night sky often glowed with the flames of burning tankers. For the world's great powers, this was not a distant show. It was an immediate threat. The United States, relying on Gulf oil and determined to keep shipping lanes open, increased its naval presence. American warships began escorting Kuwaiti tankers reflagged under U.S. colors, daring Iran to strike. In the years ahead, these escorts would lead to tense clashes, including direct battles between U.S. and Iranian forces. The Gulf had become more than a battleground for two regional rivals. It was now a flashpoint for global confrontation. For the men at sea, however, the war felt senseless and cruel. Sailors who had never set foot on the front lines found themselves under missile attack. Survivors told of leaping into burning waters, of clinging to wreckage as smoke blocked out the sun. The war on land consumed soldiers. The war at sea consumed innocents. By 1988, the tanker war had transformed the Persian Gulf into one of the most dangerous shipping zones on Earth. It was a reminder that this conflict was not limited to trenches and deserts. The Iran-Iraq war was total. It reached across borders, across oceans, and into the lifeblood of the world economy. By the mid-1980s, the front lines had settled into a bloody balance. Neither side could achieve decisive breakthroughs in the mud and trenches. And so, the war expanded once again, this time into the very heart of civilian life. Cities that once seemed distant from the battlefield became targets themselves. Iraq struck first. Beginning in 1984, Saddam ordered large-scale air raids against Iranian population centers. Baghdad's pilots dropped bombs not on army bases or factories, but on apartment blocks, schools, and marketplaces. Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, names once associated with poetry and culture, were now spoken with dread as air raid sirens wailed and families huddled in basements. Tens of thousands of Iranian civilians were killed as their homes were reduced to rubble. Iran fought back with what little it could gather. Its defenses grew more advanced. Surface-to-air missiles and interceptors reduced some of Iraq's raids. But Tehran soon turned to payback. Smuggled Scud missiles from Libya gave the Islamic Republic its answer. The weapons were crude, inaccurate, and terrifying. Launched from hidden platforms, they streaked across the sky before crashing into Baghdad. Sometimes they struck military targets. More often, they destroyed houses, shops, and mosques. The cycle of terror got worse. Saddam acquired Soviet-made Scuds and later changed them into the longer-range Al-Hussein missile. These carried massive warheads and could reach deep into Iran. By 1988, Iraqi attacks rained down on Tehran with grim regularity. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a fireball. Families dug through rubble with their bare hands, searching for loved ones. In just 7 weeks, the Al-Hussein campaign killed 2,000 civilians and wounded more than 6,000. For those who lived through it, the mental toll was huge. Parents sent children to villages far from the cities, hoping they might escape the next strike. Schools held drills where students were told to lie flat as windows shattered. Diaries from the time speak of a strange rhythm. Mornings filled with prayers, afternoons with sirens, nights with the distant thunder of falling missiles. What made this phase of the war especially bitter was its pointlessness. These missile exchanges did not bring decisive victories. They did not break enemy spirit. Instead, they spread terror evenly, making sure that civilians, ordinary men, women, and children paid the price for leaders unwilling to compromise. It was war stripped bare of illusion. No trenches, no soldiers, no flags, just explosions in city streets, blood in marketplaces, and the lingering sense that nowhere, not even one's own home, was safe. By early 1984, Iranian commanders knew that storming Iraq's walled cities head-on was pointless. The human wave attacks had bled their armies dry, and the battlefield had become an endless graveyard of heroes. They needed another path, one the Iraqis might not expect. Eyes turned to the vast wetlands of southern Iraq, the Mesopotamian marshes that stretched like a maze of reeds and water across the frontier. The marshes had always been a world apart, home to the marsh Arabs who traveled its waters in canoes and built reed houses above the swamps. For Iranian planners, this landscape promised both hiding and opportunity. If troops could slip through the wetlands, bypassing conventional defenses, they might come out behind Iraqi lines and break the deadlock. Revolutionary Guards trained for water attack, their commanders speaking in hushed tones of a strike that would echo the cleverness of past empires. But Saddam's forces were watching. Iraqi intelligence caught wind of the plan, and what waited for the Iranians in the marshes was not a breakthrough, but a death trap. When Iran launched its attack in February 1984, thousands of men moved forward through knee-deep water, rifles held above their heads. Helicopters hovered above the reeds, bringing reinforcements. For a brief moment, it seemed the gamble might succeed. Then the traps were sprung. Iraqi big guns pounded the marshes, shells sending fountains of mud and water into the air. Chemical agents, mustard gas, and nerve agents were released across the wetlands, their deadly vapors clinging to the damp air. Worse still, Iraqi engineers had strung underwater electrical cables through sections of the marsh. When current surged through the water, men screamed as their bodies shook. Entire units died where they stood. The scale of the disaster was awful. Over 40,000 Iranian troops were lost along with 49 helicopters shot down or destroyed. Survivors staggered back to their lines, their skin blistered, their eyes blinded, coughing blood from poisoned lungs. For Iraq, it was one of the war's few clear victories. For Iran, it was a national trauma, a reminder that faith alone could not overcome gas, wire, and electricity. The legacy of these marshland battles was deep, international. Watchers condemned Saddam's use of chemical weapons. Yet the outcry was quiet. Many nations supplying Iraq with money and arms chose silence over confrontation. The world, it seemed, would look the other way as long as Saddam's government served as a wall against revolutionary Iran. For the marsh Arabs, the war transformed their ancient homeland into a battlefield of nightmares. Reeds that had sheltered families for generations now hid corpses. Waters that once supported life carried poison. A landscape older than recorded history had become one more victim of modern war. The Marsh campaigns marked a turning point. Iran's dream of breaking the standoff through cleverness had collapsed. And Saddam Hussein, once on the defensive, sensed that with foreign support and ruthless tactics, he could shift the tide of war. In early 1986, after years of bloody standoff, Iran struck a blow that stunned the world. The target was the Fa Peninsula, a narrow strip of land jutting into the Persian Gulf, commanding Iraq's only direct access to the sea. To capture it would not only embarrass Saddam Hussein but also threaten Iraq's economic lifeline. The operation was carefully planned. Under the cover of darkness, Iranian Revolutionary Guards crossed the Shatt al-Arab waterway in small boats. Their paddles made barely a ripple as they pushed through the cold February night. Once ashore, they moved forward quickly, using the element of surprise to overpower Iraqi positions. By dawn, the Iranians had established a foothold, and waves of reinforcements poured in behind them. Iraq, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. For Saddam, the fall of Fa was a nightmare. Not only had he promised his people that Iraq was impregnable, but the peninsula's loss meant that Iran could choke off Iraq's access to the Gulf and project power into the very heart of the Arab world. Iraqi counterattacks were immediate and fierce. Waves of big gun attacks pounded the narrow strip of land, and chemical weapons once again filled the air with choking clouds. Still, the Iranians held firm. For Tehran, the victory was more than strategic. It was symbolic. Propaganda celebrated the liberation of Fa as a divine triumph, proof that heroism and faith could achieve the impossible. Murals of young heroes appeared across Iranian cities, showing them as the heroes who had carried the revolution across the water and planted its banner on enemy soil. The peninsula, little known before the war, now became a shrine of national pride. Across the Arab world, however, the shock was deep. Gulf monarchies, already fearful of Iran's revolutionary passion, saw in Fa a glimpse of what might come if Tehran's armies pushed further west. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait increased their financial support for Iraq, funneling billions into Saddam's war chest. Arms shipments multiplied and foreign advisors swarmed Baghdad. Fa had proven that Iraq could not stand alone. It needed the entire Arab world behind it. For Saddam himself, the embarrassment was unbearable. His reputation, so carefully built as the strong man of the Arab nation, was shattered. Furious, he ordered relentless counterattacks to retake the peninsula, each ending in failure and mounting deaths. Privately, he raged at his generals, demanding explanations, punishing perceived weakness with killings. Publicly, he doubled down, showing the war as a life-or-death struggle against Persian aggression. The fall of Fa marked one of Iran's greatest victories of the war. Yet, it also hardened the determination of Iraq's allies and set the stage for even greater battles ahead. What had been a regional conflict was now transforming into a contest with global consequences. One in which billions of dollars, foreign powers, and the fate of the Gulf itself hung in the balance. For the soldiers who fought there, Fa was remembered not as a triumph of strategy, but as a place where men waded through mud, gas, and fire to hold a sliver of land that seemed cursed by history. It was proof that, in this war, even victory felt like tragedy. By the start of 1987, Iran sought to press its advantage from Fa. The leadership in Tehran believed that one final overwhelming push could break Iraq's back and open the road to Basra, the country's vital southern city. They named the attack Karbala V, the Great Harvest, invoking the memory of Imam Hussein's heroism at Karbala, an echo meant to fuse battlefield sacrifice with religious destiny. On January 9, 1987, the storm began. Nearly 200,000 Iranian troops, Revolutionary Guards, Basij volunteers, and remaining parts of the regular army poured into the frozen wetlands surrounding Basra. Opposing them were some 300,000 Iraqis dug in behind dense lines of walls. Big guns roared for hours, pounding trenches and villages until the very earth shook. When the foot soldiers surged forward, they did so through a landscape already reduced to smoking craters and flooded fields. The fighting that followed was some of the most intense of the entire war. Iranian waves stormed Iraqi positions again and again, shouting religious slogans, carrying banners, and stepping into fire with the belief that heroism was victory. For a moment, the fierceness of their attack nearly broke the Iraqi line. Commanders in Baghdad braced for the possibility of collapse. But Saddam's government had learned from earlier embarrassments. Basra was defended with a depth unseen before. Bomb fields layered upon bomb fields, walls of sharp wire, trenches filled with oil that were set on fire, and entire neighborhoods turned into walled zones. Big guns and chemical shells rained down on the attackers. When Iranian units broke through one line, they found another waiting just behind it. The cost was horrible. For weeks, the battlefield looked like a vision from the Great War. Corpses filled the mud, sharp wire sagged under the weight of bodies. The air was thick with smoke and the harsh sting of chemical gas. Estimates suggest that 65,000 Iranian soldiers were killed or wounded in the operation. Iraqi deaths were far lower, though they too numbered in the tens of thousands. For the people of Basra, the city became unrecognizable. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Streets turned into rivers of mud and ash. Civilians who had once lived in the Venice of the Middle East now hid in cellars or fled across the desert. Their city transformed into a ruin. Karbala was meant to be Iran's decisive strike, its Stalingrad of triumph. Instead, it became its Verdun, a battle of unimaginable sacrifice that produced nothing. Basra did not fall. The Iraqi line, though battered, held. The failure marked a turning point. For the first time, the Iranian leadership could no longer claim that pure faith and sacrifice would bring victory. The words of jihad began to ring hollow against the reality of endless funerals and shattered families. The great harvest had reaped only blood. For Saddam, Basra was proof that Iraq could survive. For Iran, it was the beginning of exhaustion, a slow wearing away of hope that no amount of heroism could mend. By 1987, the war had devoured nearly a decade, and both nations were bleeding from within. What had begun with fiery promises of swift victory or divine triumph, now sagged under the weight of tiredness. Iran, once ablaze with revolutionary passion, found its economy in ruins. Years of punishments, bombings, and military mobilization had strangled industry and agriculture. Inflation went up, basic goods grew scarce, and long lines for bread and fuel became part of daily life. The families who had once sent sons to the front with pride now hesitated. Hero posters still decorated the walls of Tehran, but beneath the slogans lay grief too deep to measure. Entire villages had been emptied of their young men. Mothers whispered of sons who had vanished in the marshes or been buried without names. The words of jihad, so powerful in 1980, no longer rang with the same belief in 1987. In Iraq, the picture was different but equally grim. Saddam Hussein, determined never to show weakness, continued to pour men and money into the conflict. His government drafted university students en masse, even boys barely out of their teens, swelling his army into one of the largest in the world. Yet Iraq's economy was cracking. Billions in help from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait kept the government afloat, but debt piled higher with every month of fighting. Oil money could no longer cover the cost of war. Civilians too bore the scars. Baghdad had grown used to the sound of air raid sirens, the sudden terror of Iranian Scud strikes. In Basra, children played in streets lined with craters, their laughter, a fragile defiance in a city of ruins. Letters smuggled out from Iraqi conscripts spoke of despair. We no longer fight for Saddam. We fight because there is no choice. On the international stage, pressure for peace grew. In July 1987, the United Nations passed Resolution 598, calling for an immediate ceasefire and a return to pre-war boundaries. But neither side was ready to give in. Saddam dreamed of reversing his embarrassments, while Ayatollah Khomeini still clung to the vision of overthrowing the Ba'athist government, and so the war dragged on even as its purpose dissolved. Soldiers went to the trenches not with the passion of 1980, but with the dull acceptance of men condemned. Commanders spoke of holding on rather than winning. What had once been pitched as destiny now looked like slow-motion collapse. The Iran-Iraq war was entering its final act, not with a decisive battle or a thunderous climax, but with tiredness, the kind that hollowed nations from within, leaving behind only rubble, debt, and unhealed wounds. In the spring of 1988, after nearly 8 years of killing, the war shifted one last time. Iran, battered by economic collapse and drained of manpower, could no longer keep up its attacks. The passion of jihad had faded. Funerals outnumbered parades. Across the border, however, Saddam Hussein sensed opportunity. Backed by Arab money and foreign arms, he prepared a final counterstrike, an operation he named with calculated symbolism, Tawakkalna ala Allah, trust in God. On May 25th, Iraqi forces surged forward. Unlike the clumsy attacks of earlier years, these attacks were disciplined, coordinated, and devastating. With superior firepower, chemical weapons, and overwhelming numbers, Iraq recaptured large areas of land that had once been lost. Iranian units, exhausted and undersupplied, fell back in confusion. Within weeks, Baghdad claimed victory after victory. The cost to Iran was staggering. In just 2 months, Iraqi attacks caused over 30,000 deaths while suffering fewer than 5,000 themselves. Entire Iranian divisions collapsed. Prisoners were marched into captivity by the thousands. Equipment stockpiled from years of sacrifice was seized or destroyed. For the first time since 1982, it was Iran, not Iraq, on the defensive. Inside Tehran, the leadership faced a grim reality. Advisors begged Ayatollah Khomeini to consider peace. To continue meant only more destruction. To end it meant swallowing pride. For years, Khomeini had vowed never to accept compromise, declaring he would fight until Saddam's government fell. Now, with his nation broken, he made the fateful choice. On July 20, 1988, Iran accepted UN Resolution 598. When the ceasefire was announced, Khomeini compared it to drinking a chalice of poison. For a man who had built his rule on unyielding defiance, the words revealed the depth of his embarrassment. Yet even poisoned peace was preferable to the abyss. The guns fell silent in August, though small fights lingered. By then, the toll was almost beyond understanding. Hundreds of thousands lay dead. Some guesses approached 1 million. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or scarred for life. Economically, the two nations had burned through nearly $1.2 trillion. Cities like Khorramshahr, Abadan, and Basra were shadows of themselves, their streets lined with rubble and mass graves. And what had been gained? Borders remained largely unchanged. The Shatt al-Arab dispute, the war's supposed trigger, returned to its pre-1980 lines. The Iran-Iraq War was in the purest sense a standoff soaked in blood. Yet its legacy was not stillness but fire. Iraq, though victorious in the final campaigns, came out crushed by debt. Saddam, desperate for money, turned his gaze toward Kuwait, a decision that would light the Gulf War only 3 years later. Iran, meanwhile, came out more isolated yet hardened, its revolution tempered by sacrifice. For both peoples, the war left scars that would not heal in a generation. The boy in the trench from the opening scene, the child who adjusted an oversized helmet and marched toward enemy guns, was not unique. He was a symbol of an entire generation consumed by a war without victory. When the ceasefire came, there was no triumph, only silence. The Iran-Iraq War had ended as it had been fought, without winner, without purpose, without end to the suffering it had caused.